Hello my friends, welcome to the Mr. Beastly channel. I hope you like this one. Now on to the story. The phone call came. At precisely 3:17 a.m., slicing through the silence of my apartment like a scalpel. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at the unknown number flashing on the screen. With trembling fingers, I accepted the call. Hello? My voice cracked in the darkness. There was no response at first, only static that sounded less like digital interference and more like distant, inhuman whispers. Then a voice emerged, synthesized and emotionless, yet carrying an undertone of something ancient and wrong. We have been watching your research, Dr. Keara O'Connell. The voice didn't so much speak as it vibrated through the speaker, sending unpleasant vibrations up my spine. My name is Director Chen. I represent an organization that requires your expertise. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake despite the exhaustion that had claimed me mere minutes before. What kind of organization? The cleanup crew. The way he said it made the two words sound like both a title and a warning. The conversation that followed was surreal. An offer from an entity I couldn't verify to work at one of the most radioactive places on Earth, Chernobyl. The details were vague but tantalizing. Unprecedented funding for my research into nuclear mutation patterns, access to restricted areas of the power plant, and the opportunity to study phenomena that defied conventional physics. I'm listening, I found myself saying, even as alarm bells screamed in my head. The exclusion zone has changed, not just from radiation, but from something else entirely. Director Chen paused, and in that silence I heard a sound like static and wet tearing. We need you to document these changes, to help us understand what's happening to the plant and to those who were exposed. The next morning, as I packed my bags for the journey to Ukraine, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not by people, but by something else entirely. When I glanced out my window, the streetlights seemed to flicker in a pattern that was almost rhythmic, a Morse code from somewhere beyond our dimension. The flight itself was unnerving. The plane cut through clouds that had an unhealthy orange tint, and as we approached Keara, I noticed strange atmospheric distortions, shimmering patches of air where reality seemed thin, like a window into another place entirely. The drive to the exclusion zone was even worse. Through the car windows, I saw abandoned towns not just decayed but altered. Buildings that seemed to have melted at unnatural angles, trees that grew in impossible spiral patterns, and in one particularly horrifying moment, what looked like a figure standing perfectly still in an empty field, except its silhouette was wrong, too tall with too many limbs. When we finally arrived at the makeshift base near the power plant, I was greeted not by Director Chen but by Igor Volkov, a man whose appearance alone could make a grown person's blood run cold. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, with muscles that bulged beneath his uniform like coiled cables. His face was a roadmap of scars, and his eyes, cold gray orbs that seemed to see right through me, held no warmth whatsoever. Dr. O'Connell, he grunted, extending a hand covered in what appeared to be faint glowing markings. Welcome to hell. As I took his hand, something cold and electric crawled up my arm, a sensation like static but somehow more organic, as if microscopic things were crawling across my skin under the surface. Igor handed me my uniform, which felt unnaturally heavy in my hands. The material was strange, part fabric, part something else entirely that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. This is your gear, he said, pointing to a pile of equipment. Geiger counter, night vision, and this. He held up a device that looked like a cross between a tablet and some kind of weapon, its surface covered in glowing symbols I didn't recognize. What about radiation suits? I asked, noticing the absence of proper protective gear. Igor snorted, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Radiation is the least of our worries here, Doctor." As we walked toward the power plant itself, the atmosphere grew thick with dread. The famous red forest that surrounds Chernobyl was visible in the distance. Its pine trees not just dead but twisted into grotesque shapes, as if something had crawled out of the ground and reshaped them. The reactor building loomed before us, a monolithic structure that seemed to pulse with an inner light, despite being long abandoned. As we approached, I noticed strange patterns forming on the concrete walls, symbols that appeared and disappeared like oil slicks on water, each one sending a fresh wave of nausea through my stomach. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something organic yet industrial, like rotting metal mixed with decaying flesh. The dim lighting cast long shadows that moved independently of their sources, sometimes detaching from walls altogether to slither across the floor, before disappearing into cracks I hadn't noticed before. "Never go anywhere alone," Igor warned me again as we ventured deeper into the bowels of the plant. "There are things here. They're attracted to curiosity." I nodded, my mind racing with possibilities both terrifying and fascinating. For the first time since receiving that phone call, genuine excitement mingled with my fear. Whatever was happening in Chernobyl, whether natural mutation or something more sinister, I had been brought here for a reason, and I intended to discover what that was. But as we turned down a long, poorly lit corridor, I caught movement from the corner of my eye, a glimpse of something pale and multi-limbed darting between support beams before vanishing into the darkness. Igor didn't seem to notice, but I felt it, the sudden drop in temperature, the way the shadows seemed to deepen around us. Something was watching me now, not just observing, but studying, as if sizing up prey that had wandered into its territory. And worst of all, I had the distinct impression that this thing was waiting for something. The dim emergency lighting cast long, dancing shadows across the decaying walls of the Chernobyl power plant as we ventured deeper into its forbidden heart. Every step echoed unnaturally in the cavernous corridors, each sound amplified by the oppressive silence that had settled over this place like a shroud. Igor moved with the predatory grace of a hunter who knows his territory intimately. His massive frame seemed to absorb the scant light around us, creating an aura of darkness that followed him like a second skin. The glowing markings on his hands pulsed faintly in time with his heartbeat, a biological compass I couldn't decipher but somehow trusted completely. "Never go anywhere alone," he had repeated for what felt like the 100th time since my arrival. "This place has teeth, and it's hungry." I nodded absently, my mind racing as we navigated through corridors that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. The air itself tasted of ozone, and something else, something metallic and biological, as if the very atmosphere was alive with microscopic organisms feeding on radiation. "These aren't just mutated animals," Igor said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through my bones. "There's something new, something the plant has nurtured." As we turned down another corridor, I noticed strange patterns on the walls, geometric symbols that appeared and disappeared like oil on water. They seemed to pulse with an inner light, as if trying to communicate something beyond human comprehension. "That's how they mark their territory," Igor explained, following my gaze. "We don't know what they're saying, but we've learned not to ignore the signs." Suddenly, the emergency lights flickered violently, plunging us into near darkness for several heart-stopping seconds before returning to their normal dim glow. In that brief moment of darkness, I saw something move at the edge of my vision, something tall and impossibly thin, its silhouette wrong in ways I couldn't immediately define. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sudden pounding of my heart. Igor's hand instinctively went to the strange device at his side, the one that looked like a cross between a tablet and weapon. "See what?" I don't know, I admitted, shaking my head as if to clear it. Just something out of place. We continued deeper into the bowels of the plant, the atmosphere growing heavier with each passing step. The air pressure seemed to increase, creating an almost physical barrier against our progress. It was as if the building itself was resisting our intrusion. This section used to be the primary reactor control room, Igor said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the vast space. Before everything changed. As we entered what appeared to be a large chamber, I froze in my tracks. The far wall was covered in what looked like biological growth, a pulsating mass of dark tissue that seemed to breathe independently of the building itself. Strange lights flickered within its depths, casting eerie shadows across the floor. "What is that?" I asked, unable to tear my eyes away from the horrifying spectacle. "Home," Igor replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "To something." Before he could say more, the emergency lighting failed completely, plunging us into absolute darkness. In that moment of total sensory deprivation, I heard it, a sound like wet tearing, followed by what sounded like hundreds of whispering voices speaking in a language that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my skull. Then, from the darkness, they emerged, creatures that defied all logic and biology. Their forms were impossible combinations of human and animal features, twisted beyond recognition by forces I couldn't begin to comprehend. Their eyes glowed with an otherworldly green fire, and their skin seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I stood paralyzed as they approached, my scientific curiosity warring with primal fear that threatened to overwhelm me. These weren't just mutated animals. They were something else entirely, something the radiation had birthed in the darkness of this abandoned place. "Keara, what are you doing here?" Igor's voice rang out through the darkness, suddenly sharp and urgent. "My apologies," I stuttered, trying to regain control of myself. "I was just exploring." "You should never have gone alone," he shouted, grabbing me by the arm with surprising force. "This is dangerous territory." As we retreated back toward safety, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, something intelligent and malevolent that had been watching us from the shadows all along. The creatures seemed to be drawn to our radiation, but they also seemed interested in us, in a way that suggested they weren't just mindless predators, but hunters with purpose. And as we escaped into the relative safety of the well-lit corridors, I caught one last glimpse of something pale and multi-limbed darting between support beams before vanishing back into the darkness from which it came. It was watching us now, not just observing, but studying, as if sizing up prey that had wandered into its territory. And worst of all, I had the distinct impression that this thing was waiting for something. Waiting for me to return. As we retreated back to safety, the creatures followed us. It seemed they were drawn to the radiation and wanted nothing but to consume it. The emergency lights flickered erratically now, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move with a will of their own across the decaying corridors. Each pulse of light revealed glimpses of our pursuers, impossibly tall figures with too many limbs, their movements fluid yet unnatural, as if defying gravity itself. "We need to report this immediately," Igor said, his voice strained as he quickly dialed a number on his walkie-talkie. His hand trembled slightly around the device, and I noticed for the first time that even our seemingly indomitable guide was affected by the unnerving atmosphere of this place. Over the next few weeks, I learned more about the rules Igor had mentioned earlier. Each member of the cleanup crew was required to carry a personal logbook, where they documented any strange occurrences or sightings during their shifts. These logs were then submitted to their supervisors for analysis and containment measures. My own journal quickly filled with sketches of impossible geometries that appeared on walls, transcriptions of whispers in languages I couldn't identify but somehow understood instinctively. The creatures began attacking members of our crew more frequently now, drawn by radiation levels that were higher than ever before. Their methods of attack were as terrifying as their appearance. Some used sonic frequencies that caused internal bleeding without leaving a single mark on the skin, while others seemed to phase in and out of reality itself, appearing behind victims with impossible suddenness. I watched in horror one evening as Marcus, a young technician from our team, fell victim to what we called the phase shifters, creatures that seemed to exist partially outside our dimension. He was walking down the corridor when suddenly he screamed, his body contorting at impossible angles before vanishing entirely. The next morning, his uniform was found in a perfect circle on the floor, still warm but empty of its occupant. The once bustling power plant was now a scene straight out of a nightmare. Emergency lights flickered sporadically, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that seemed to play tricks on the mind. The air itself felt thick with something more than just dust and radiation. It tasted metallic, with undertones of decay and something almost organic, like the smell of rotting vegetation mixed with ozone. I began experiencing strange dreams while in Chernobyl, visions of impossible architecture stretching into infinity, voices that spoke to me in languages I shouldn't have been able to comprehend. When I mentioned this to Igor during our daily debriefings, he merely nodded gravely and said, "The plant affects everyone differently. Some hear the whispers more clearly than others." One particularly horrifying incident occurred when we discovered a section of the facility where reality itself seemed thin, like a membrane between worlds. The walls were covered in what appeared to be biological growth that pulsed with an inner light, occasionally opening to reveal glimpses of landscapes that couldn't possibly exist on Earth. As I watched one such growth pulse rhythmically, it suddenly extended a tendril toward me. In a moment of pure terror, I stepped back just as the tendril made contact with the floor where I had been standing. The concrete beneath my feet began to dissolve, revealing what looked like a swirling vortex of colors and impossible geometries. "The boundaries are weakening," Igor explained, when I reported this incident in my logbook later that day. "Sometimes they reach through." The radiation levels were fluctuating erratically now, creating hot zones that appeared and disappeared without warning. Our standard equipment was becoming increasingly unreliable as the very laws of physics seemed to bend around us. During one routine patrol, I stumbled upon a group of creatures gathered around what appeared to be a makeshift shrine, a collection of twisted metal and biological matter arranged in precise geometric patterns. As I watched from behind a support beam, they began to emit a low humming sound that resonated through the entire facility. The emergency lights flickered in response, creating a strobing effect that made it difficult to focus. Suddenly, one of them turned its head directly toward my hiding place, and for a brief moment, I felt as though our minds had connected. An overwhelming sense of ancient intelligence and malevolent curiosity washed over me before the creature returned its attention to whatever ritual they were performing. When I mentioned this to Dr. Elena Ivanova, our resident biologist, she paled visibly and suggested we avoid that particular section of the facility altogether. "We don't know what they're doing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But whatever it is, it's changing them, making them more organized, more intelligent." As days turned into weeks, the situation at Chernobyl continued to deteriorate. The creatures became more aggressive, attacking anything that stood in their way with increasingly sophisticated methods. Our numbers dwindled with each passing day, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain order among what remained of our crew. The psychological toll was just as devastating as the physical threats. Sleep became impossible as nightmares plagued us all, and paranoia ran rampant through the ranks. Some members began claiming they could hear the creatures communicating with each other in a language that sounded like static mixed with whispers. Igor noticed these changes too, and he took to leading patrols himself more frequently, saying that fresh eyes were needed to properly assess the situation. The final straw came when we discovered that some of our equipment had been moved, not stolen, but rearranged in impossible patterns that seemed to serve no practical purpose. When I asked Igor about it, his expression grew grave and he merely said, "They're learning." As we prepared to evacuate Chernobyl, I couldn't shake off the feeling that there was still something hidden within its walls, waiting for us to stumble upon it once more. The creatures weren't just changed by deformation, some had become smart, very intelligent, but very evil as well. I knew at this point that we may be stuck here permanently. As we prepared to evacuate Chernobyl, I couldn't shake off the feeling that there was still something hidden within its walls, waiting for us to stumble upon it once more. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency hum that resonated in my bones, an almost imperceptible tremor that suggested something massive was stirring beneath our feet. Our evacuation plans had been meticulous, every step carefully calculated by Igor and his team of specialists. Yet despite these precautions, I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see those impossibly tall figures with too many limbs darting between shadows. The emergency lighting flickered sporadically now, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move with a will of their own across the decaying corridors. Each pulse of light revealed glimpses of our pursuers, impossibly tall figures with too many limbs, their movements fluid yet unnatural, as if defying gravity itself. Their silhouettes twisted and contorted in ways that defied biology, suggesting they existed partially outside our dimension. "We need to report this immediately," Igor said, his voice strained as he quickly dialed a number on his walkie-talkie. His hand trembled slightly around the device, and I noticed for the first time that even our seemingly indomitable guide was affected by the unnerving atmosphere of this place. The static from the radio seemed to carry voices whispering just at the edge of hearing, fragments of language that sounded both ancient and futuristic simultaneously. As we moved toward the evacuation point, the walls around us began to change. Biological growths pulsed with an inner light, occasionally extending tendrils toward us before retracting suddenly. The concrete itself seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in a slow, rhythmic pattern that made me question my sanity. I caught glimpses of impossible geometries etched into the surfaces, symbols that appeared and disappeared like oil on water. "Stay close," Igor warned me, his voice barely audible over the sound of dripping water that echoed through the corridors. "It's dangerous down here." The evacuation route led us deeper into the bowels of the power plant than we had ever ventured before. The air grew thick with the scent of ozone, and something else, something organic yet industrial, like rotting metal mixed with decaying flesh. Our flashlights cut through the darkness in narrow beams, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced through the silence. One of our crew members had stumbled upon a creature unlike any we had seen before. Its body was an amalgamation of different animals, its skin covered in sharp scales and spines that pulsed with bioluminescent light. The creature moved with unnatural grace, its multiple limbs coordinating in a way that suggested intelligence rather than instinct. "Never go anywhere alone," Igor had repeated countless times since my arrival at Chernobyl. Now I understood why those words were not just advice but a warning, a reminder of the horrors that lurked in every shadow, waiting for the unwary to wander too far from safety. As we retreated back toward what remained of our base camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness. The creatures seemed drawn to our radiation signatures, but they also appeared fascinated by us, as if studying human behavior with clinical detachment rather than predatory interest. The emergency lights flickered violently again, plunging us into near darkness for several heart-stopping seconds before returning to their normal dim glow. In that brief moment of blackness, I saw them moving at the edge of my vision, not just one or two creatures, but dozens, perhaps hundreds, their forms shifting and changing in impossible ways. "We need to find a way to escape through the underground tunnels," Igor said, his voice tense with urgency. "There's no time left." As we ventured deeper into the darkness below the surface, the atmosphere grew heavier still. The air pressure increased unnaturally, creating an almost physical barrier against our progress. It was as if the building itself was resisting our intrusion, as if Chernobyl had become a living entity that wanted us to stay. Our footsteps echoed off the cold concrete walls, adding to an unsettling sense of dread that settled over me like a shroud. I caught glimpses of impossible architecture stretching into infinity in the periphery of my vision. structures that couldn't possibly exist within the confines of the power plant's basement levels. Suddenly, Igor stopped dead in his tracks, holding up a hand for silence. His eyes widened as he stared at something in the distance, an opening that hadn't been there moments before, revealing what appeared to be another world entirely. Through this portal, I could see landscapes that defied physics and biology, colors that had no names and forms that seemed to shift and change with each passing second. "Stay away from that," Igor whispered, his voice barely audible over the strange humming sound now emanating from beyond the opening. "That's not where we're going." As we turned away from this impossible sight, I noticed something else. A series of symbols etched into the walls around us, glowing with an inner light that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. They formed patterns that suggested some kind of language or code, one that spoke directly to parts of my brain I didn't even know existed. The underground tunnels grew narrower as we ventured deeper, until we were forced to crawl on our hands and knees through passages so tight they scraped against the walls. The darkness was absolute now, broken only by the faint beam of our flashlights which seemed weaker with each passing moment. Suddenly, the ground beneath us gave way, plunging me into darkness as I fell what felt like an impossible distance before landing heavily on something soft and yielding. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light that filtered down from above, I realized with horror what I had landed on. A massive creature of some kind, its body covered in slick, pulsing flesh that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Igor appeared at the edge of this new chamber, lowering himself down with surprising agility despite his size. His eyes widened as he took in our surroundings, a vast underground space filled with impossible structures and creatures that defied all known laws of biology. "We need to find another way out," Igor said, his voice strained with urgency. "This place is worse than I imagined." As we moved through this subterranean nightmare, I began to understand something about Chernobyl. It wasn't just a power plant, or even an exclusion zone anymore. It had become something else entirely. A nexus between worlds, a breeding ground for horrors that could never be contained. The creatures here were unlike anything we had encountered before. They moved with purpose and intelligence, their forms shifting and changing in ways that suggested they were not bound by the same physical laws as us. Some seemed to phase in and out of reality itself, appearing and disappearing without warning. As we continued our desperate search for an exit, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, watching us from the shadows with ancient, malevolent intelligence. And worst of all, I had the distinct impression that this thing was waiting for us to stumble upon it once more. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced through the oppressive silence of the abandoned corridor. The sound echoed unnaturally, bouncing off decaying walls that seemed to absorb and distort it, turning a single cry of terror into a cacophony of whispers from countless directions at once. One night, during a routine checkup on our equipment in Sector G7 of what had once been Reactor 4, I noticed something profoundly disturbing about one of the creatures we'd come to call the shifters. It was lurking near a vent that emitted an unusual hum, the kind of sound that vibrates through your teeth and settles into your bones. As I watched through my night vision goggles, the creature's form began to ripple at the edges. "Something's happening," I whispered into my comm unit, my voice cracking with more than just fatigue. Igor's response was immediate, his Russian accent thickening under stress. "What is it now, Doctor?" "The shifter. Its body is changing shape. It's not just moving, it's morphing." On the monitor next to me, bioluminescent patterns pulsed across the creature's skin, a sickly green that made my stomach turn. Its multiple limbs, which had previously been spindly and insectoid, began to thicken, forming jointed appendages that resembled something between a crab's claw and a human hand. Then, with a sound like wet tissue tearing, new growth sprouted from its back, fleshy antennae that swayed independently of the creature's movements. "What in God's name?" Dr. Elena Ivanova whispered over the comm system. Her voice was barely audible over the static that had become increasingly present since our arrival. "The radiation readings are spiking again," Igor reported, his voice tight with concern. "Unnaturally so." I adjusted my Geiger counter, watching as the needle bounced erratically across the scale before settling at a level that should have been lethal but somehow wasn't. The creature before us seemed to be thriving in what would kill any known form of life. "This isn't evolution," I said, my mind racing through possible explanations. "This is something else entirely." As if responding to my words, the shifter turned its head toward me, though head was a generous term for the amorphous mass at the top of its body. Its central sensory cluster, which we'd previously believed to be eyes, pulsed rapidly, emitting a low-frequency hum that resonated through the concrete floor beneath our feet. "The atmospheric pressure is dropping," Elena reported from her station in Sector B3. "And there's something else, particles in the air, something metallic and organic." I glanced at my atmospheric analysis display, a piece of equipment we'd brought specifically to monitor environmental changes. The readings showed an abnormal concentration of what appeared to be nanoscale structures suspended in the air around us. "Nanites," I suggested, the thought sending a chill down my spine despite the oppressive heat of the containment suit. "They don't match any known military or industrial designs," Igor said, his voice strained as he studied his own display. "They're organic in nature, growing." The shifter before us completed its transformation, revealing itself to be something completely new, a creature that defied all known biological classification. Its body was now roughly the size of a small horse, but with proportions that seemed both impossible and terrifyingly deliberate. 6 limbs ended in multi-jointed appendages that moved with fluid precision. Along its spine ran a row of bioluminescent nodules, each pulsing with light that seemed to be communicating some silent message. "Dr. O'Connell," Igor said urgently, "you need to document this, every aspect." I raised my camera, capturing images as the creature began to move, not with the jerking motions we'd seen in previous encounters, but with a grace that suggested consciousness and purpose. It moved toward something, the source of the strange humming, with deliberate steps. "The creatures are evolving," Elena said, her voice filled with horror and fascination. "But they're not just changing randomly. They seem to be developing intelligence." As if in response to this statement, the shifter paused near a terminal that had been dead since our arrival. One of its appendages extended toward it, tapping against the keyboard with unerring precision. The screen flickered to life, displaying symbols I didn't recognize, mathematical equations mixed with what appeared to be genetic sequences. "Impossible," I breathed, stepping closer despite every instinct telling me to retreat. The creature turned its central sensory cluster toward me again, and this time, I felt something, a presence in my mind that wasn't quite a thought but more of an impression. It was ancient, alien, and infinitely curious about our kind. "They're studying us," Igor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Learning from our technology, from us." The implications hit me with the force of a physical blow. These weren't just radiation-mutated creatures, they were something new, something that had emerged from the confluence of human scientific intervention and forces we didn't understand. "They're evolving faster than anything on Earth," Elena reported from her station. "And they're not just changing physically, they're developing technology." As if to confirm this, the shifter completed whatever it was doing at the terminal and moved toward a cluster of equipment we'd set up to monitor radiation levels. With movements that seemed too precise to be accidental, it began rearranging components, fusing wires together, manipulating circuits with delicate precision. "They're building something," I said, realization dawning as I watched the creature work. The humming grew louder now, coming from multiple directions as more creatures emerged from hidden passages throughout Sector G7. Each one was different, a testament to their rapid evolution and apparent ability to adapt their forms for specific purposes. "Pan to the main reactor chamber," Igor instructed, his voice tight with urgency. I adjusted my camera feed, watching as a group of these newly evolved creatures gathered around what appeared to be a makeshift shrine constructed from scrap metal and biological tissue. At its center pulsed something, a glowing core that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "What is that?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "Their power source," Elena said, her voice filled with dread. "I think they're building a containment device for whatever's in the reactor." As we watched in horror, one of the creatures, larger and more grotesque than the others, placed its appendage against the glowing core. The humming intensified, and for a moment, reality seemed to distort around them, time slowing down as shadows deepened and the very air vibrated with energy. "They're not just studying us," Igor said, his voice filled with a new understanding. "They're preparing something." The lights flickered violently, plunging us into near darkness before returning with an intensity that hurt my eyes. In that moment of transition, I caught a glimpse of something impossible. What appeared to be a portal opening in the center of the reactor chamber, revealing not another part of the power plant, but something else entirely. A swirling vortex of colors and shapes that defied description. "They're trying to open a doorway," Elena whispered over the comm system. "And they know we're watching." The creatures turned their attention toward our location as one, their bioluminescent nodules pulsing in unison. A silent, terrifying acknowledgement that they knew we were there, and worse, that they had been expecting us all along. "The boundaries are weakening," Igor said, his voice filled with resignation. "This place, Chernobyl, it's not just a power plant anymore." As the reality of our situation settled upon me, I understood what he meant. We weren't researchers, observing a phenomenon. We were witnesses to something that transcended human understanding. A convergence of science and forces beyond our comprehension. And we were trapped in the middle of it all. It was during one of our most harrowing moments that I stumbled upon a hidden laboratory deep within the plant's bowels. Inside, I discovered a series of experiments conducted by Dr. Ivanova. She had been trying to find a way to neutralize the radiation affecting the creatures. As I examined her notes, I realized that the only solution might be to use nuclear weapons to destroy the power plant completely. It was a desperate measure, but it seemed to be our last hope. With heavy hearts and determination, we made the decision to use nuclear weapons to destroy Chernobyl. We knew the risks involved. The explosion would cause massive destruction not only of the power plant, but also potentially endangering nearby cities. As we prepared for what might be our last stand against the creatures that haunted us, Dr. Ivanova explained her theory on how the nuclear weapons would neutralize the radiation and ultimately save us all. "I'm scared," one of my crew members whispered, as he looked up at the sky. Dark clouds were gathering overhead, signaling the impending explosion. "We have to trust in the science," Igor said firmly, gripping his weapon tightly. "We did what we had to do." The cleaners, Dr. Elena Ivanova. As I stood watching from the observation deck of the command center, my breath caught in my throat. Below us, Chernobyl wasn't just a power plant anymore. It had become a crucible, a cauldron bubbling with the promise of something new and terrible. The nuclear weapons we'd deployed weren't solutions, they were catalysts, keys turning in locks that should have never been found. The countdown ended not with a bang, but with a whispered sigh, as if reality itself held its breath before the transformation. I watched through reinforced glass, as the first wave of radiation met the biological horrors we had unleashed upon ourselves. The creatures, no longer mindless mutations but something far more intelligent and terrifying, seemed to anticipate what was coming. They gathered at the epicenter, their forms shifting and merging in impossible ways. "Radiation levels are spiking beyond comprehension," Elena reported, her voice trembling through the comm unit. "But it's not the normal radiation we've been tracking. It's different." Different indeed. The very air around Chernobyl began to shimmer with an otherworldly glow, as if reality was thinning like watercolor left in the rain. Strange geometric patterns, symbols that appeared and vanished with each flicker of light, danced across surfaces throughout the facility. "Something's happening," Igor growled from beside me, his hand resting on the device at his hip, the strange tablet weapon combination he'd carried since my arrival. Something we never anticipated. Below us, the creatures began to change in response to the radiation bombardment. Their forms stretched and compressed, limbs multiplying and fusing in ways that defied biology. The largest of them, a hulking beast that had once been a shifter, suddenly erupted into a swarm of smaller entities, each no larger than my hand but moving with terrifying purpose. "The explosion isn't killing them," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the static that had become increasingly present on our comm channel. "It's evolving them." As if in response to her words, the smaller creatures began to merge again, forming something new, a hybrid being that pulsed with an inner light unlike anything we had witnessed before. Its form was a nightmare of biology and physics combined, limbs that seemed to phase in and out of existence, eyes like pools of liquid darkness, and skin that appeared to be made of shadow given form. The explosion we had detonated wasn't destroying Chernobyl, it was completing its transformation into something else entirely. A nexus between our world and another, one where the laws of physics were merely suggestions rather than absolutes. "Evacuate," Igor suddenly barked, grabbing my arm. "Now." But as we turned to flee, I felt it, the subtle shift in the air pressure, the way the shadows seemed to deepen around us even as emergency lights flickered erratically above. Something had followed us up from the depths of Chernobyl, something that had been studying us for weeks, learning our movements and patterns. I caught a glimpse of it from the corner of my eye, a tall, impossibly thin figure with too many limbs, its form shifting between solid and ephemeral like oil on water. It moved without sound, its presence announced only by the sudden drop in temperature, and the feeling that something was watching us from just beyond our peripheral vision. "The boundaries are breaking down," Elena reported, her voice now frantic. "Reality is thinning." The concrete itself seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in a slow, rhythmic pattern that made my stomach churn. "We need to get out," Igor insisted, pulling me toward the evacuation route we had planned weeks ago. But as we moved through the corridors, I noticed something disturbing, my own reflection in the windows of abandoned offices. For the briefest moment, it wasn't my face looking back at me, but something else, a form that seemed both human and not, with eyes like liquid darkness and too many limbs twisting in impossible angles. I blinked, and the illusion was gone, but the feeling remained, a wrongness settling in my bones, a sense of transformation that I couldn't explain but knew to be real. "The evacuation route is compromised," Elena reported over the comm system. "The creatures are ahead of us." Ahead of us? But how had they moved so quickly? As if answering my unspoken question, one of our crew members, a young technician named Anna, suddenly screamed, clutching her arm as dark tendrils erupted from beneath her skin. They pulsed with an otherworldly light, writhing and twisting before solidifying into something that resembled the creatures we had been fighting. "We're changing," Igor whispered, his voice filled with horror as he watched one of his own crew transform before our eyes. "It's happening to us too." And indeed it was. Across the facility, reports came in over our comm system, other members of our team experiencing similar transformations, their human forms giving way to something new and terrible. The radiation wasn't just killing, it was changing, rewriting the very code of life itself. As we rounded a corner, I saw what had happened to Marcus, the crew member who had disappeared earlier in our journey. He stood perfectly still against a wall, his body twisted into impossible angles. His skin pulsed with inner light, and from his back sprouted multiple limbs ending in delicate appendages that moved independently of one another. "Marcus," I whispered, taking an involuntary step forward. He turned his head, though head was no longer the right word, and regarded us with eyes like pools of liquid darkness. There was no recognition in them, only ancient intelligence and curiosity about these strange beings who had wandered into its territory. "We need to run," Igor said, grabbing my arm again and pulling me away from the transformed crew member. But as we fled deeper into the bowels of Chernobyl, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer running from something. We were becoming it. My own body felt wrong, as if something was stirring beneath my skin, waiting for its moment to emerge. The evacuation route ahead of us was blocked by what appeared to be a solid wall of concrete and steel. But, as we watched in horror, the surface rippled like water disturbed by a stone. A portal opened, revealing not another part of the power plant, but something else entirely, a swirling vortex of colors that defied description, filled with impossible geometries and landscapes that couldn't exist in our world. "The boundaries are breaking down everywhere," Elena reported, her voice now barely audible over the static that had become our constant companion. "It's spreading." And indeed it was. As we watched from our hiding place, I saw them, dozens, perhaps hundreds of creatures emerging from these portals throughout Chernobyl. They moved with purpose and intelligence, their forms shifting and changing in ways that suggested they were not bound by the same physical laws as us. "We're too late," Igor whispered, his hand trembling around the device at his hip. "The containment has failed." But even as he spoke, I knew it was more than just a failure of containment. It was something else entirely. A new beginning for humanity, one that would see our species transformed into something new and terrible. "The radiation signature is changing," Elena reported over the comm system. "It's adapting, learning." As if in response to her words, I felt it, the subtle shift in my own body as something stirred beneath my skin, reaching out toward this new reality we had created. The symbols that had been appearing and disappearing around us now seemed to resonate within me, speaking directly to parts of my brain I didn't even know existed. "The boundaries are breaking down everywhere," Elena reported again, her voice filled with a mixture of horror and fascination. "It's spreading across the globe." And indeed it was. News reports began flooding our comm system, similar phenomena occurring in other locations around the world, each one tied to nuclear facilities or areas with high radiation levels. The transformation wasn't limited to Chernobyl, it was happening everywhere, a silent revolution sweeping across humanity as we knew it. As I watched through the window of our command center, I saw what had become of Chernobyl. The power plant that had once been a symbol of human achievement now stood transformed into something else entirely, a nexus between worlds, a breeding ground for horrors that could never be contained. The creatures that emerged from its depths were no longer mindless mutations, but something far more intelligent and terrifying, beings that moved with purpose and intent, their forms shifting and changing in response to the new reality we had created. And as I felt my own body beginning to change, transforming into something new and terrible, I understood what was happening. This wasn't an end. It was a rebirth, a transformation of humanity itself, forever changed by the horrors we had unleashed upon ourselves. The last thing I remember is watching as Igor's form began to twist and contort, his human features giving way to something new and terrible. He turned toward me, though toward was no longer the right word, and regarded me with eyes like pools of liquid darkness before speaking in a voice that wasn't quite sound, but more of an impression in my mind. "You have seen what is coming," he said, or perhaps I only thought he did. "Now you will become part of it." And as Chernobyl pulsed with inner light around us, I knew that there was no turning back. This was the end of humanity as we knew it, and the beginning of something new, something terrible, something beautiful in its horror. The transformation had begun, and there would be no stopping what came next.